Thank you, thank you. So I figured I would start just by giving you, before I go into the technical details, it's going to be an exploration of what I did and you know, how much more is left to do. So I figured, okay. So I wanted to give you just a taste of what SwiftGodot looks like. This is what the application looks like, and I'm trying to build an application that feels very native on iPad OS. So you can see that the project launcher follows Apple's conventions, and it is not the same thing as Godot on the desktop. And here we do use something very similar to what to the new idioms that Apple is pushing. This is what they're using now on Swift Playgrounds. And then you pick one of these projects. Which one are you going to use? The platformer? Yeah? So you get one of this. It downloads the project. And then you tap to open it. It takes a couple of seconds to launch. This is the same thing that Godot would do. And there we go. Now, there's a couple of elements here on the screen. This is your standard Godot UI. I did do a couple of things. So as you can tell, you start with the full screen. You don't really start with any of these panes open by default because there's not a lot of space. So I want you to notice one thing. This is an M4 iPad. So it's a very high resolution iPad. But despite that, you can see that the fonts are very big. You can see that there's not a lot of rows that you can actually use. And this is by design. So in fact, I don't even have control over those rows. I could fake it, but if I use the defaults for the system so that they remain tappable, that is as small as you can go. So you need to use idioms like these ones, right? Like little buttons so you can hide or show those elements in the UI. Then you have the standard things, like for example, you want to explore those properties, right? So you go here, and then you get your inspector. And this is what the inspector looks like in here. Right? This is how you connect nodes, and we'll get to that later. I reorganized the menus because, I don't know if you noticed, but when you click on Godot and you get to these menus that you have here, they're massive, right? Like, for example, this menu on Godot is massive. I had to redo this thing because there's just not enough space on the screen. So I changed all of this. I had to rewrite all of these elements. Some of these are cute because you get like live feedback on the changes. You don't have to do OK cancel on those things, so that is pretty neat. This is also kind of cute. I was very surprised that this worked with very little effort. The other thing that I like from that I copied from Apple is this idea of the toolbar, so you can move it because again, you don't have a lot of space, so you gotta get rid of this thing. And the thing that I copied is this little effect that Apple has, which is this bouncy, kind of playful thing where you get rid of it, right? So you just kind of drag and push it. It's the same effect that you see on FaceTime, for example, or on the screenshot app. And here we have the debugger, the output preview. So anyways, that's roughly what Godot on iPad looks like. So let me now walk you through the project. And we'll come back to that in a second. So this project started, if you didn't come here last year, for the last couple of years, I've been building bindings of the Swift language to Godot. And the reason I did this was asking for forgiveness to the game developer community for imposing garbage collection on them many years ago. And this is my way of paying my debt to society. There's a whole talk from last year. You can look at that. So I was working on this thing for the last couple of years, on and off. And we had a big community of 2 people using it. The summer of last year, I was working on Vision OS. We're building this terminal application. We're having a blast doing shaders and terminals and 3D maps and things like that. That's what we're up to. Joseph and myself were partners in this company. And then Unity happened. I'm not going to go into the details, corporate, what is it called? Immolation, corporate immolation. And then overnight, there was like a flood of people coming into the SwiftGodot channel. So we had a lot of people contributing and participating and sending patches. So we went from 2 guys on the channel to like 80, and now we're like 200 and something. That was kind of the context. And then as part of the things that I was just playing around, because we were really prototyping different things, we're doing things on Vision, I got the editor working on October 26th on the iPad. But it's very different than what you just saw, right? It was just, you had the shell and then the whole editor as is. This is a desktop application, really not much to it. And I really didn't do much, honestly. I didn't really do very much. You remove like a couple of things and you hard code a path and you're up and running, right? So Godot runs on the iPad already. Oh, I'm actually not using this correctly. Joseph, slideshow. Oh, okay, all right, now I'm using it correctly. You couldn't really use this very effectively, right? The interactions were wrong. You had those 2 paths in there that didn't really make a lot of sense. They were not very useful. All the gestures are very alien to iPad users. They're fine for a game, but not for the editor and for applications like that. So that day, I made a joke, and I thought it was a funny joke, right? And I said, it has a lot of rough edges, but maybe I should make this a fully native application, and I should put it on the App Store. So that was my joke, and then I forgot about it, and then I came to Godot, I came to GodotCon in Munich, and I had a blast. It was great. Met lots of interesting people at the conference, and we came back very energized. Right? We came excited. And we figured, well, maybe we should do something more than just the SwiftGodot bindings, right? Maybe we should take that Godot thing and that we had on the iPad and then build something with that. And if you were not here last year, what I said is, hey, why don't we rewrite the editor in Godot in Swift, because Swift is high-level language, it's safe, all these things. So why don't we do that? And kind of on the plane on the way home, it's like, well, that would be nice for security and safety and productivity, but it doesn't really change, it doesn't really change where Godot is today, and it's an uphill battle. So that's when we started to think about working on the iPad. Now, I had about 10 slides about why the iPad, and I love my iPad. It's loved by people that, creators, people that draw, artists, my kids, #1 users. We do like the touch experience, so doing all your things with your fingers is very different than working with a mouse all the time. So that is something that it is fabulous. Like, it used to be that the only way of doing touch experiences was with a Wacom tablet and having your digitizer, very expensive systems. You had to have this expensive dongle attached to the Wacom tablet. These slow, bloated, insecure dongles. And so the iPad is, to me, it's a magical device. And if you follow me on Twitter, you'll know that that I'm a big fan of all Apple products. So we kind of were getting very excited on the plane. Also, the other thing that happened was we met Gergely, and Gergely presented. He had taken SwiftGodot and had worked with another company to make Godot embeddable and controllable by a native application, right? So this had been, the first. In fact, some 10 years ago, I don't know, 10 years? I don't know when. It was like 10 years ago. I called Juan. When we were building a separate company, I called Juan. I said, hey, congratulations on launching this Godot thing. I'm looking for an embeddable engine. I want to have a game engine that I can embed into an application. Can we make Godot do that? He's like, no. Just go and use something else. Godot will never do that. So we ended up using another engine, and we invested years of our life in that. It works, but it's a different world. So what was very interesting is that Gergely worked with one of our users, SwiftGodot users, to make Godot embeddable and controllable, which was my dream for many, many years. And he came to me and said, hey, why don't you, this SwiftGodot thing is interesting, but why don't you do, fund us to do vision or something else? I was like, well, we'll think about it, right? So we're thinking about it, and on the way home, we realized, you know what, we should probably work with Gurley and his company to do a lot of the work here because, I know iOS, I know some Godot, but I'm not an expert, right? I don't do OpenGL. I'm not going to be able to fix a single bug with whatever rendering problems we have, and they knew how to do it. So we called Gurley a couple of weeks after that and said, hey, Gurley, we are very excited. We want to work with you, but it's not in the project that you want. It's a different project. And he was on board. So let me tell you what the challenge is from my perspective. So Godot on iPad really is a struggle between kind of these three big things, right? On the one hand, you have the expectations of an existing Godot user, right? So if you're an existing Godot user, you come with a series of expectations of what you can do. On the other hand, you have this device that has all kinds of limitations imposed by Apple or imposed by the form factor. And then lastly, you have the expectations of an iPad user, like my kids. Like my kids spend all day long playing Roblox, and they build levels for certain games like Aki Robots, and they have all these things, and they're used to use this thing, and it is not a desktop app, right? You don't use these desktop apps on the iPad. It's very different. So one of the most important things that became, the number one problem that we had is that Godot users expect to be able to develop in Godot and test their changes, right? You have this loop where you make changes and you edit the thing and it updates live, and you can make changes and inspect variables. And this works for Godot because on the desktop, I didn't show you that running. Anyways, I'll show it to you in a second. But this works on the desktop because you have the Godot editor, and when you press play, it launches a separate process. And these two processes communicate with each other through the debugger interface. And the Godot editor can say, hey, change this thing. And then the process can say, hey, I stopped at this breakpoint. So you have all this communication going back and forth. But the problem is that iPad only lets you run one process at a time, right? You're not allowed on iPadOS to launch another process, a child of yours, right, and keep the two running at the same time. That is not possible. iPadOS does not allow it, right? And it has to do with battery life and security and all kinds of things. But that is just the way that iPadOS is. This is something that you're not allowed to do. They have a little bit of a hack. So you could run an extension. So an extension would allow you to run the main editor and a little process that could be separate. But the problem is that this is limited to only 15 megabytes of memory. Newer versions is 20 megabytes of memory, which would work for maybe a baby Pac-Man, but it wouldn't really work in practice. So that is kind of one of the big challenges that we had. So before we could even consider, getting serious about this and working with Miguel was, can we make this thing, can we run the editor and the game at the same time? So the idea that we had is, what if we just, we run the editor, and before we run the game, we manually go and reset the whole editor. So we shut down OpenGL, we clear every single variable, every global, we clear it, right? So I spent a couple of weeks just doing that. And so essentially, I launched the app, I implemented these reset methods everywhere, and I cleared every single variable in Godot, right? So you run the thing, and then I reset the state manually. Maybe there were better ways, like mem setting this heap or something. I didn't do that. So this was reliable, it worked, right? I was impressed. So I could run the editor and then run the app. Magically, it worked, but it also sucked. And the reason is, you saw how long it took to run Godot a second ago, right? So you have to bootstrap the editor, and then I reset it, and then I run the game, and then when you go back to the editor, you got to do it again, right? So I kill the whole world, I reset the whole world, I have to start again. So, all right. But the signal was, all of the Godot state, it's kind of there, right? So if I clear it, I'm going to be able to run it again, right? So, I mean, in theory it works, but there's a difference between theory and practice, right? So in theory, what is the expression? In theory, and practice are the same, but in practice they're not, right? So, so this was a good kind of test. It's like, this can be done, right? The state can be controlled. So the next attempt was, can we virtualize Godot, right? So what I did is, and there's a little bit of a patch there. So essentially, every time that there's an access to a global variable, and this is just one line that shows you, but every time that there's an access, oh, I cannot show it. But every time, I mean, can you follow this along, folks? So essentially, every time there's an access to a global variable, like this one, right, that says if instance is equal to null PTR, this is a singleton, right, it would allocate it. And instead what I did is I would have a big-ass variable that contained the state of the whole app, right? So I had a big-ass structure that contained the entire state of the app. And for each class in the app, like in this case, zip archive, I would have a member, right? So groot means the Godot root, and I had a structure inside called zip archive, and then I would put every single static variable there. So I put every single static variable that I could find on the program, and I put it there. What is interesting is that this actually worked. So I was able to virtualize running the editor and then running the app at the same time. And the trick is, all you gotta do is change that groot variable. So groot points there, it's the editor, then you change it and it points there, and now it's the game, right? So you can ping pong this variable back and forth, and you got the thing running. It is a little bit complicated. Every time I merged a patch from Godot, it would crash because there was a new static variable introduced. So eventually something would crash, then we would need to go and track it down, and where was the mistake, and it takes a couple of hours, but I got it. And merging Godot takes some time, maybe a day or two. So every time there's like a big release, so it would be better if they just takes like 6 months off, so I can merge more often. But it's doable, right? And this is a little tweet that I had where I said, hey, this works. The problem is that it's a very intrusive patch, right? It's a massive, ugly patch. And this was the patch, I don't know, sometime in November, right? So it's 397 files changed. By the way, then I found that there were more, right? It's just, I hadn't touched everything, so I hadn't crashed the whole app. But anyways, that allowed me to run the game. And then Gergely suggested, hey, I think we can run the process side by side, because at this point it's like, okay, I can run this and the app, one or the other, right? Just one or the other, but not two at once. And ideally, we would like to run two at once, because that way I can debug and single step and do the whole thing. And Gergely is like, why don't you use thread local storage, right? So groot, instead of being a global, is a thread local storage. Now, I'm kind of simplifying the process, because it's not only that, you also have to manage two separate initialized graphic contexts, and you have to pump events, get a little bit creative, right? So luckily, Gergely was already working with us, so I didn't have to deal with this. And that's how we got it working. So essentially, at this point, we sort of had a proof of concept that we could get Godot working on the iPad. So the foundation for I would say the most complicated problem of getting Godot on the iPad was there. So now we could build something interesting on it. The big problem for me is that it was still a desktop app. And it's just not a good iPad experience. And the iPad community, I would say the iOS Apple community, kind of values polish, quality, attention to detail a lot more than the Android community, right? So the Android community, you can give them a McDonald's burger and they'll be happy, or cold fries. Food is food. And the iOS community is just a little bit more, they like their escargot, right? And so we started on a whole process of how do we turn this into an app that we would be proud of, right? How can we make this an app that people on the iPad would use it. It's like, yes, this is a first-class iPadOS citizen. It does what we expected. It works the way that it's supposed to work. It integrates with the whole operating system, and it's a pleasure to use. And then, slowly, I got to tell you, it started, there were baby steps like, well, we're just going to do these 2 pieces. And then it's like, oh, these 2 pieces are good. And then we had another piece like, oh, this is magical, right? So the more we iterate on this, the better it got. And so I went from, do the bare minimum to ship to, I really want to get an Apple Design Award. And so anyways, that has been holding me back because I don't want to ship this. I think that I'm going to get one chance with the iPad community, the iOS community, to try this. And if I ship something that is like, oh, you just put a PC app to the iPad, it's like, what's wrong with you? So anyways, I want to get an Apple Design Award. Now, yesterday, I took this picture, right, of a gentleman using Godot. And, so Godot is designed for these big displays, right? And people have a lot of space, right? So this guy, look at that monitor. It's the size of a human being, or a small human. And the iPad is really, really different, right? So I think the first thing that you have to realize, right, is that Godot as it exists today is very heavily, it works great with the mouse. It has a lot of hotkey combinations, so tons of shortcuts. And it works great for a desktop developer, very efficient for desktop developers. But the iPad, you don't really have a keyboard by default, right? Like most of the time, you'll just have this. I brought a keyboard today because I can just put it here. But usually, you don't have a keyboard or a pen, right? So these are optional things. By default, you should work just with a pencil. The other thing is, like I mentioned at the beginning, the minimum size that you can tap is called 44 points. These are not typographical points as we're familiar with, but it's a unit of size that Apple uses. And in this particular display, it's 3 pixels. So 3 pixels make 1 point. So for you to have a tappable region, you have about 150 pixels of height. So these are big areas, right? So I can't just use Godot as it is. Right, the elements are too small. You cannot tap it, or the tap is going to go somewhere else. The other thing is that people kind of expect a bunch of gestures that you can use on iPad to be available, and those were not available. I would say that the interesting thing about the iPad being so limiting, it's a little bit like when people ported these games to these tiny devices. They had to get very creative about how you do audio and how you do animations. So I think that the iPad brings a little bit of that. As we've been working on bringing Godot to this platform, one of the things that became apparent is that it's one of the diseases that we had in one of my previous projects. So many, many years ago, most of you were not born, but I worked on this project called GNOME, and GNOME was a desktop for Linux. We started in 2001, 2000, so 24 years ago. Who is older? Who is younger than 24 years? Younger. You're not younger. Okay, who has less than 24 years? One? Just 2? Everybody else is a veteran? All right, 24 years ago, we released this thing, and at the time, it was revolutionary because it was, yes, it's ugly, but that was the vibe at the time. And I just want to tell you one thing. When we shipped this version of GNOME, we made the same mistake that Godot makes a lot, and which is we don't want to pick a fight, right? And we want to please a lot of masters. So this particular release, this is called GNOME 1.2, and I don't know if you can tell on those menus, so I did a little zoom in. These are menus of different applications that were available. And in particular, there's a menu. It's not open here because I had to resort to an old screenshot, but there's a menu there that says clocks, okay? So GNOME 1.2 shipped with 5 different clocks. And part of it is contributors, like Juan was saying yesterday. Contributors says like, hey, I have a clock, and my clock is like a digital clock. I was like, yeah, we'll get it in. And then somebody's like, no, 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 that clock architecture is wrong. I got this one that is, it's like, I don't know what it was. Do you want to get it in? It's like, can you merge? It's like, no, because I'm using Pix maps and he's using fonts and it's different. It's like, yeah, we'll get it in. So anyways, we ended up shipping with 5 clocks, right? Because we couldn't make a decision. As designers, we were not really embracing our role as designers. And in fact, there's a funny story from Sun, because around this time, Sun Microsystems needs to change their desktop. They're all desktop, and they pick GNOME, and they start to put some process into it. And they run an actual usability study. And the usability study says that users cannot figure out how to display the time. But we ship 5 clocks, right? So we realized that Godot has a lot of that. There's a lot of places in Godot where I guess they don't want to pick a fight, so they just add an option. So if there's 2 ways of doing it, you just add an option. And there's millions of these. Well, not millions. There's hundreds of these. Hundreds of it. And it becomes a complexity problem because now you have to maintain multiple code paths. Some of them conflict with each other. Some bugs don't work very well. So anyways, it was a lot of stuff. And for me, the problem is it took a lot of space on the screen. There's a lot of space on the screen that I just couldn't use. So we'll get to that in a second. But I decided we're going to rewrite everything in SwiftUI. And the way that we're going to do is we're going to keep the editor core as is. And I'm going to put a UI system that it talks to the editor and uses the editor as a model. So the source of truth is the Godot editor, and I'm just providing a separate user interface for it, right? And the key to this is that we're going to stay compatible with the Godot desktop, right? It's going to be compatible with the Godot desktop. And this is important because it allows me to remove a lot of stuff from the UI. Because then, if you really need to configure the font for your func variable, then you can just go to the desktop, do your work there, and then copy the file over to the iPad, right? So I am explicitly going to remove a ton of stuff from the user interface for the sake of saving space, right? So I did a lot of work to reorganize the UI, to remove things that is not needed, and if you really need it, you can always go back to the desktop. So that was very important for us. The other thing, right, that we wanted to do is essentially embrace a couple of things from Apple. First of all, I'm not a designer. I don't have good taste. So what we did is essentially we delegated the design choices to Apple. So Apple has a design system. They tell you how your app should look like. So rather than trying to come up with a crazy idea, and Godot has a lot of interesting explorations into user interface, 20 minutes. All right. So what we did instead is let's just follow the guidance from, I'm going to be late. We're just going to follow the guidance from Apple in this regard, and we're going to follow everything that they say under human interface guidelines. The second thing that we're going to do is we're going to draw a lot of inspiration from their pro apps and the best apps on the iPad. Because I'm not a designer. I don't know these things. So what we did is we looked at things that we needed to solve, and it's like, how is this paint application or vector drawing application doing it? And it's like, oh, this is neat. Let's bring that over, right? One of the other things, so what was key is that I didn't invent a new UI. I chose not to do design. I chose not to choose fonts. I said whatever Apple uses, that's what I'll use. The other thing that to me was very important is that about 20 years ago, or 24 years ago, there was an article going around, and I cannot find it again. It's impossible to find this article again. But there was this notion of dark spots. And I read it 20 years ago, and the problem is that now if you Google dark, you get all kinds of things about dark UI. It talks about dark patterns in UI, like things to trick users. But this was a very old article, and it's been in the back of my mind for about 24 years, and it's dark spots. And it's this idea that your eye gets drawn to these areas with high intensity colors, right? In this case, you have static body 2D at the bottom, and then you have these 2 icons, the eye and the eye. That little things with an eye and then an eye. And it's been bothering me, and then when we look at this UI, so I put it this UI, I implemented these things, like something bothers me about this, and I couldn't realize what it was. And then I realized that Apple had actually kind of given you some guidance of how to deal with this. And the way that you do it is that you use a secondary color. So essentially, you tone down the colors so that your attention is not drawn there, so your eyes is not drawn there. So I would love to find the article. If you know where it is, let me know. But I started to very consciously go through the whole UI with this thing in mind, right? It's like we need to remove things that are distracting and taking your attention from where it needs to be. So that was a great exercise. And I'm going to show you one of my favorite things on the internet that shows how you can use color and font sizes to draw the attention of the user and not take it away. So I'm going to give you like 10 seconds to read this. And you've probably seen this in the past. If not, so this to me was very interesting. So I started to, again, I'm a compiler guy. I didn't used to do these things before, but I started to take this very seriously. So these two things are, hanged on my wall in my office, and I constantly use these things. So the font sizes from Apple, how they're used, and their hierarchy of colors. Now, by March, this is what Godot on iPad looked like, right? So we're getting there. We have the same elements that I showed you. There's a couple of things that are kind of ugly as is we still have the tab bars from Godot. We still have the menu bars from Godot, which are, they're overwhelming. You can see there's a lot of information there. I shrank that thing. And you can see that the properties is like, all right, you did a native thing, and I guess the toggle is an iOS toggle, but the rest is not that great. And I knew I needed to do something, but I didn't know what, because I'm not a designer. And this summer, Apple released this app called Final Cut Pro. Final Cut Pro is an app for editing video, and it's intended for professional use. And I downloaded it. It's like, oh, God, this is so beautiful. I don't know if you can tell, but this is a beautiful UI. No, it is a beautiful UI. So, I mean, take a look at this. These are my properties, right? Position, rotation, scale, right? I mean, okay, it works. But look at this thing, scale and position. You see, oh, it's nicely stacked. It's grouped, right? It's like, oh, that's why they use a hierarchy of colors. So, so I want to draw attention to a couple of things, right? The hierarchy of colors for this particular thing, and then look at that control. You see that little control there? It was magical. And then I realized why they did that. And the reason is, at this point in time, right, if you go back to my thing, if you tap on the X button in the 0.0 there, that would pop up the whole screen dialog, right? It would pop up the big-ass keyboard on the screen, right? So your whole UI goes away. All this thing with text, with A, B, C, D, ASD, it's on your screen, completely useless, just covering your app, and everything moves up and down, right? So you're tapping, and everything is moving up and down. It is really not a touch UI. So I decided to copy those two things, but let me show you this live, so you can appreciate this thing. So player. Oh, hold on. I'm going to have to kill this thing. Oh, it did not go? Hold on. How do I do this? Screen share? Here? Screen? Okay. Is that it? Yep. Okay. All right, so let me show you this little guy. All right. So you see this little thing? So rather than entering the value directly there, right, you can just scroll it with your finger. So that's nice. Or you can tap on this thing, and then you get a pop-up, properly sized, right? But I want to show you something that, in my mind, oh, there's a bug here, so please ignore that. But if you want to do some fine control, so I'm going to long press, okay? Pay attention. This I copied directly from them, okay? So you long press. Do you see that? That was not my idea. I copied it from Apple. It's beautiful. One thing I didn't show you is this thing running in action, but here it is. So this is the multi-process running. The editor is running here, and this guy is also running. Now there's another thing that I want you to look at, which are these controls here. I'm going to mess it up, but these are actually iOS-provided controls. And I'm taking a little detour here, but the reason why it's interesting to us is because most of you are building games for either keyboard or controller or arrows or mouse, right? And when you bring most games to the iPad. So when we're taking a look at all of your games and all these canny games and all that stuff, none of them work out of the box. So you have to use like an external plugin and drop in the joystick thing, and what was it called? Anyways, you have to put in a bunch of extra code to make it work. So, so we implemented this thing, Gurgly implemented it, where we are essentially using the iOS platform virtual controller, right? So this will pop up this virtual controller for your app, and it will behave as if you had a controller. Or if you have an actual controller attached, then this goes away, and you can use it. So the nice thing is that we can bring existing desktop games and put them on iOS without any work on your part to get the controller working. Anyways, so let me go back to this thing. So anyways, this was the UI, and these are the changes that I went through. Now, the other thing that to me was fascinating was I didn't know what to do. I didn't know what to do with the settings on the app because you have project settings, editor settings. I didn't know what to do. Luckily, another app from Apple, Logic Pro, like showed me the way. It's like, oh, they have a nice idiom on top. You switch back and forth. So I copied that thing. But let me tell you what I did here. This is one of the areas where I really departed from Godot. And I can probably show you the real thing. Hold on. How do I do this thing? How do I do the sharing again? Well, while I get this thing going. So there's two separate set of settings. One is the editor settings, that if you use Godot, you've seen that there's like 1 million settings that you can change, right? And yeah, I think I got it, but I need to share. So there's like 1 million settings that you can put. All right, I think I got it. What? Oh, it's there. OK, I got it. OK, so Godot has 1 million settings. And I said, I don't want that. We go back to the discussion about, as designers, there's a lot of things that you don't need. Like, I don't need people to configure every single color on the editor. Worthless. I'm going to make a choice, and I'm going to make a theme that works with the system, right? So if I go to Go settings, you'll see that I currently only have 2 settings. Debugger settings that I don't even know if they're necessary, but I'm going to assume that you folks need it to make your game work fine, right? So all the things that you can customize for debugging are here. And the code editor, I don't show a lot. I'm not going to let you configure the kerning, the interlane spacing, no, none of that. I'm going to, on your behalf, as your sommelier, I'm going to provide you with something that pairs well with the iPad. So that's for the editor. Now, for the project, I don't have that liberty because the project settings actually affect how your game runs. So I can't remove those features. So the project settings, you get to keep them all. Every single one of them. Even this advanced thing that shows like 7 billion options. They're all there for you. We did change the UI a little bit. Oh, God damn it. Let me go back here. We did change the UI a little bit so that, I don't like this, Godot has like tabs inside of tabs instead of tabs instead of tabs. So I tried to find a way of expressing that here, right? So like shader globals, we put it here. Plugins, we put it here. Import defaults. And look at this beautiful thing, right? Font data. Look at this. Font data. And then in a smaller font, secondary color, dynamic font, right? Instead of thing with parentheses that looks ugly as hell, right? So very nice. Very demure, very cutesy. All right, let me go back to, oh, hold on. I got to stop this. All right, it doesn't matter. They're not checking the time. So now let me tell you how all of this works together, right? So there's a little bit more, but these are the 3 big buckets of code that we did. The first one is libgodot. So Gurgly had done some libgodot work for this other company, and we said, we like what you've done. Let's continue doing this thing. My understanding is that this patch is now mature enough and is making its way through 4.4. And if we overcome the objections of some people that will go unnamed, everybody will get to benefit from this feature. Was that you? that looks like you. Yeah, that looks like you. Yeah, you're like the kind of, you use Android, don't you? Yeah, it's typical Android behavior. And, and anyways, I have to say, LibGodot is my dream of like 10 years ago, 15 years ago, when I first called Juan. I said, dude, can we do this? And he's like, no, go away. So finally, it's happening. And this is what we use in the editor to embed the views and put all of these different things in the UI so that I can mix those two worlds. But I think that is also very powerful for, oh, I got plenty of time. It is very powerful for people to actually use Godot and embed it into their app. So if you're building a native iOS or Android or Mac app, now you can have like a native app and then embed some content for Godot. Or maybe, or you just have the launcher perhaps, and then you launch your game. Or maybe it can just be a little window that has something, right? So you can spice up your existing apps with a Godot scene, right? So a little window runs a Godot scene. Another window could run another Godot scene. So anyways, I'm very excited about that, not just for me, but for the community as a whole. And hopefully when I get back to Boston, I'll be able to put together this into a nice package for Swift users. And Android people, I'm sure the HP can't wait to do it himself. The other thing that we did is, Godot actually exposes a ton from the editor to the language bindings through GD extension. So a lot of what you see that I did there, it's just using GD extension creatively, right? So I talk to Godot constantly, and I get the data out of Godot, and I surface it to the editor, right? So the source of truth continues to be Godot. There's a handful of things that are missing. It's about 100 APIs. And the proper thing is to put it in probably 50 different places. So 100 APIs and 50 different places, like a method here, a method there. I didn't want to deal with the maintenance and the burden of having to maintain 50 different places, so I put a big-ass type that has it all. It is not pretty. I'm not proud of it, but it works. And I think that if there is interest, I can turn that into proper patches, right? It's just that I submitted a patch like a one-line fix, and it's been stuck in review for 2 years or a year. So anyways. So I'll be happy to provide that if somebody else wants to do like other UIs, like a web UI that is fully native with React or HTML and things like that. It would be useful in that scenario. But it's essentially a dumping ground for everything that is missing. And the third piece, the third kind of big bag of changes is this routing idea. And the idea is, whenever I'll show you. Well, we'll get to that in a second. We'll talk about the routing in a second. So it's essentially, how do I make Godot dialogues look pretty on iPad? So first you need to understand that Godot on iPad itself is about 95% SwiftUI. So I didn't use the old technology from Apple, which is called UIKit. I use SwiftUI, it's all SwiftUI. I would say that if it wasn't for SwiftUI, I would probably not even attempt to do this thing. And the reason is that SwiftUI is built on this idea of the source of truth. And you declare what the UI is, declaratively, based on what the data model contains. And then if you change the data model, SwiftUI changes the UI for you. So you don't have to deal with that. So if you worked in the Godot editor, you'll know that the Godot editor essentially keeps pointers to different things. And as you change things, it goes and pokes at things. And kind of like, it's like a machinist turning knobs everywhere, right? So you change a state variable, and it goes and changes all kinds of knobs. And that, I think, is a source of problems. In SwiftUI, there's no such thing. In SwiftUI, you change the source of truth, and then you say, this is what the UI needs to react like when that changes. So if you have a variable called like hide variables or show variables, the way, the hide advanced that I just showed, in your code, essentially, just have, hey, iterate over all the elements, and then you have something like if is advanced, show, else, skip, right? Oh, I'm going to be so late. And then you don't have to do anything else. You don't touch anything else. There's no, hey, refresh yourself, update yourself. You don't need to track anything. You just change that variable, and magic happens. So in fact, they used to have this system, and it was kind of tedious to use, But on iOS 17, this became the standard. So I would say if I had done this a year ago in iOS 16, I would have not even attempted this. It's just too much work, right? But now I have this thing where Godot editor is the source of truth, and I can reflect that into my observable model, and then SwiftUI does the rest. It's pure magic. Now, one thing that I don't know if you noticed, but Godot on iPad is actually hybrid, and there's kind of, this is from the highest amount of polish to the least amount of polish, right? So I have the new editor shell completely written in SwiftUI, right? And this embeds the 2D editor, the 3D editor, and then has a native text editor. Then high traffic text dialogues. We'll talk about that in a second. The third one is a system where for rare pieces or plugins, I will just embed the native view, right? So if you write a plugin and you stack a menu into that beautiful toolbar of mine, I have no way of knowing what you did, right? And I want your plugin to run. So what I do is essentially, if you insert one of those objects, I'm just going to embed it there, right? So that's using the libgodot thing. So I'm going to embed that view, I'm going to put it there, right? So at least the functionality will be there. It's going to look a little funky because it's not going to use that beautiful material, that translucent material from SwiftUI, but it's going to work. And lastly, there's a bunch of little dialogues that pop up left and right that I've not seen or they're rare to trigger. And for those ones that I haven't rewritten, it will just pop up the Godot one, right? So for example, when it comes to high traffic dialogues, what I mean is like, this is the file dialog for the desktop version of Godot, which works great on desktop, but that is not what an iPad user expects. An iPad user expects something like this, right? So what I had to do, right, for each one of these dialogues that are high traffic, things that people are going to use over and over and over and over, and they need to be native, what I needed to do essentially is to keep the API. So what I do is for example, in this particular case is editor file dialog. I created a proxy editor file dialog, right, that is an empty class, and all it does is all the settings that you poke at this thing, when you say, hey, show the dialog, instead I send a packet to Swift and I say, hey, please display this with the native version, right? So I am going through all of these high traffic dialogues and replacing them so that instead of calling the Godot version, it calls the SwiftUI version. Now, quickly, I'm going to go through the limitations. Because of the limitation that Apple imposes on the platform for security and their App Store policies and et cetera, only JavaScript is supported. So that is the sole language. Okay, all right. A big fan of JavaScript here in the front. The what? It's my baby, but it ain't going to work. I know. It ain't going to happen. Anyways, it is not going to happen. The other one is there is no support for third-party GD extensions, right? So if you have a third-party C++ GD extension, it is not going to work. Now, we understand, and the reason is you can't just add new dynamic libraries to a product that has been approved by the App Store, right? It needs to be code signed. It needs to be, I got it. Oh, questions. Oh, that includes questions. There's no questions. So because of this security requirement, we cannot add these things. So it is very important so what we're going to have to do is we're going to have to take the most popular GD extensions that you folks want, and we're going to have to virtualize it, and we're going to have to stash it in the binary, right? So we were going to do this for Jolt, because a lot of people use Jolt, but apparently Jolt is going to be now in Godot out of the box, so I don't need to do that work. But we do need to do some of these, and I don't know what those are because I'm not a game developer. So the nice thing is, today we're launching the beta test. So if you are an iOS developer, you can sign up in here, and two things are important for you. If you want to sign up, we need to have your test flight ID. Not your email, but whatever test flight ID you have, or your Apple ID, so you can sign up for the program. And second, we need to know which extensions you need so we can port those extensions, because otherwise it's only going to work with the extensions that we bundle. So I guess we have 10 seconds for questions.
10 seconds.
All right, I'll be here. I'll be in the back.